Welcome to qiphyedu. Today we'll be looking at marginal utility and consumer choice. Now this chapter is actually the first chapter in the A2 economics syllabus, and so we're going to tackle that until the end of the A2 economics syllabus for A levels. Alright, let's start. Okay, so let's start off with the definition of utility. The definition of utility is the satisfaction received from consuming a good or a service. So let's say you consume a can of cola and you are happy with that consumption. That consumption would be known as utility. All right. And then this is for utility. And then there's another term, which is marginal utility. Now, marginal utility is basically the additional satisfaction gained from consuming an additional unit. Like, let's say, for example, you consume one can of cola and then you decide to consume a second can of cola. That utility that you gain from the second can of cola would be the marginal utility that you obtain. So let's say, for example, let's say the utility that you gain from drinking the first can is 50, for example, and then the second can, the utility that you receive is 30. That 30 would be considered as your marginal utility. All right, and then for marginal utility, there is a law which is law of diminishing marginal utility, and that is, if let's say you were to consume like additional units down the road, the additional marginal utility that you'll gain from consuming that particular good or service would decrease down the road as well. So like, for example, just like what I mentioned just now, like let's say you consume the first can of cola, you get a marginal utility of 50. Second can will give you 30, and probably down the road, third can will give you like 15 and 10 and then 5 and so on and so forth. So the more units that you consume, the less marginal utility that you have from consuming the additional units, which can be represented by this graph here. For example, you can see that the number of chocolate bars that one person consumes. Assuming that person only consumes one chocolate bar, the marginal utility will be 30. Then if let's say the person decides to consume another unit of chocolate bar, let's say he consumes 2 chocolate bars, then the marginal utility for that second chocolate bar would be 26 as stated in the graph here. Now let's say that person decides to eat another chocolate bar, then the marginal utility gained from the third unit of that chocolate bar will be 21. All right, so this is how marginal utility is represented on the graph, which is the item itself, the number of items, and then the marginal utility units. All right, and then let's take a look at how marginal utility is represented when there is represented with demand. So you can see that you could technically represent your marginal utility with a demand curve like this one, which is downward sloping. So if let's say our marginal utility is calculated like this with alongside our price, then this curve, which is a downward sloping curve, would then be the marginal utility curve as well. It can be a demand curve, it can also be the marginal utility curve. So let's say our price is more than your marginal utility, assuming that your price is somewhere around here. That means that the quantity you purchase will be less than Q star, which will be somewhere around here. If let's say the price or marginal utility is actually lower than the marginal utility, let's say somewhere around here, the quantity that you purchase will be somewhere around here, which is more than the quantity star. All right, so basically your marginal utility would basically be the price, and then the quantity purchase. Your quantity purchase would then represent the marginal utility. So let's say, for example, the fifth good that you purchase is $5. Then the marginal utility would then be 5 units. Basically, if that's how it's calculated, then it will be 5 units. So quantity bought, let's say, would be 5. Okay, 5 cans of Coke, and then your marginal utility for the 5th can of Coke would be 5, and then the price is $5. So that's how it's counted with the demand curve. And then the total utility will basically be the total satisfaction received from consuming every chosen units of a good or service. So by adding up all the marginal utilities of each unit together, and then you'll get the total utility, like what I mentioned down here, which is calculated by adding marginal utility of every unit consumed together. All right. So I'll take the marginal utility of the first unit consumed, the marginal utility of the second unit consumed, all the way to the last unit that I consumed, combine together, and we get total utility. All right, and then let's look at the equi-marginal principle. So a consumer would want to actually maximize their satisfaction from consuming two goods. And so a consumer would be able to maximize it by using the equimarginal principle, where if you were to divide your margin utility with the price of the good for one item, it must be equal to the other good that you want to consume, like the other good with the margin utility divided by its price. If both of them are equal, then that will be the amount that the consumer would then consume. So if you look at the table, for example, assuming that the number consumed is only 1, the margin utility from apples would be 116. Of course, if let's say you were to go down the route, you realize that the margin utility from apples would decrease because, like I said, what I mentioned earlier, based on the law of diminishing marginal returns, marginal utility, is that if let's say you were to consume more and more the same good, then your margin utility would be decreasing and then this apparent in the margin utility from apples. So the first apple you consume, you get a margin utility of 160. The fifth number you consume would get 40, and then the margin utility from apples divided by price. The price here, you can see if we were to take 160 divided by 8, we get $20, which is the same across the board. So every single apple is priced at $20. So the margin utility from apples divided by the price would be 87432, and that means that the price of each apple will be $20. Okay, then let's take a look at the margin utility from cola. The cola's margin utility will be 440 units. That will be at the start, and then at the end will be 40 for the margin utility. Now, if you look here on the right hand side, which is the margin utility from cola divided by price, if you take 440 and you divide by 11, you get 40. And this is the same for every additional unit spent. Just have to divide by 40 and then you get the numbers on the right. So divide by 200 with 40, you get 5. 60 with 40, you get 1.5. And lastly, 40 divided by 40, you get 1. So you can see that if you were to consume 2 apples and 2 colas, then you realize that the margin utility from apples would be 7. And then the margin utility from cola would be 7. So both of these would be, this would be 2 apples and 2 cola. Would be the amount that this person would consume in order to maximize utility, because the margin utility divided by price is 7 for apple, and then it's the same for margin utility from cola divided by price. So the person would then consume 2 apples and 2 colas to maximize their utility. Basically, we're taking into account the margin utility divided by the price here in order to assume that in order to maximize utility for both goods, this is how we do it, which is by dividing margin utility with price. Although it technically doesn't have to be the exact same number for both. It just so happens that it's 7 and 7. So for this one, there will be 2 apples and then 2 cola. But if let's say you get like a margin utility that is similar, but then it has to be 5 colas instead of, let's say, 5 colas instead of 2 colas, then you can take like 5 colas and 2 apples. The margin utility, as long as the margin utility is the same, you can calculate the number consumed for both these goods. All right, so that's how the equimarginal principle works here. And then now let's look at indifference curves and budget lines. So your budget line, as you can see here, it looks like your PPC, your production possibility curve. Although this one is just one straight line. And then you can see that there are 2 products that a person may consume, which is apples and bottles of cola. It looks like a PPC, but PPC is used to show the maximum combination of 2 goods that can be produced in the economy. This one will be the maximum combination of 2 goods that a person would be able to spend with his or her budget at a particular period. So you can see that, for example, if let's say Abdul was let's say he is going to purchase 6 apples, then he wouldn't be able to purchase any cola. If let's say he were to purchase 4 apples, he'll be able to purchase 1 bottle of cola. All right, so that's how the budget line works. It's something like PPC, but it's for consumers. The consumption possibility for one person. All right. And then the indifference curve, you can see that the indifference curve is basically curved, and then it's actually used alongside our budget line, which we'll see later. It's basically the curve showing the combination of two goods that give equal total utility, which means that the curve here, whatever point that you touch on, it will give the customer this equal total utility, which means that, for example, if I were to draw a budget line here, then it will be either this point or this point that we'll get something like this. It will either be this point or this point that we'll get equal total utility but different quantity of a good that will be purchased. So if we go down here, before we continue on, let's look at marginal rate of substitution. Marginal rate of substitution would be the slope of an indifference curve. So showing the amount of good given up for another good while keeping Q constant. Let's say this slope would be a marginal rate of substitution. So I were to substitute, like, let's say one good for two goods, for example, but then I want to make sure that my total utility is constant. This is possible by using your IC curve or your indifference curve alongside your budget line, which I want to mention just now, we will see later. So we'll look at the consumer equilibrium and you get a rough idea. So consumer equilibrium is basically the point at which consumers maximize utility at the tendency between the indifference curve and budget line. So you can see that we have three indifference curves. Okay, and then at the moment, a person could only maximize his or her utility by consuming at IC2. If you were to consume at IC2, then you'll be able to consume 2 apples and 2 bottles of cola, right? As long as it's tangent, you touch the line, then you'll be able to maximize your total utility by calculating the amount at the point where the IC curve touches the budget line, and this is illustrated here as the tendency here. This will be a consumer equilibrium, all right? And then if let's say there's a change in Abdul's budget, assuming that now instead of buying 6 apples and only all 3 bottles of cola, now Abdul is able to purchase 10 apples and 5 bottles of cola. And then the IC curve will now shift from IC2 to IC3. So when you shift from IC2 to IC3, instead of 2 bottles of cola and 2 apples, now Abdul would be able to purchase 4 apples and 3 bottles of cola. So this would be a shift up, and then this will be the amount that he'll be able to spend at the moment, as long as it's tangent. And then if you look at change in Abdul's budget, if it's a change in Abdul's budget, then it will look something like this. Okay, a change in Abdul's budget when cola is an inferior good. Alright, so if cola is an inferior good, you'll realize that the IC curve, if you look closely, the IC curve for this graph, the graph is slightly tilted above. So you can see that there's no decrease in the bottles of cola that one person will consume. But if you look at this particular indifference curve, it's actually tilted to the bottom, which means that the person will now consume more apples but less cola if let's say there is an increase in the budget. So you can see that the budget line now shifts from BL0 to BL1. And when it shifts from BL0 to BL1, at the same time the IC curve would then move from IC2 to IC3. And when it moves from IC2 to IC3, you'll see that the point now shifts downwards. So the point shifts downwards. So instead of consuming 2 bottles of cola, it's now maybe 1.8 bottles of cola and probably about 4.7 apples in this context. So let's say the indifference curve is now a bit higher, like probably at this position. When it's at this position, you'll be able to consume more cola, but then you'll consume less apples. But then at the same time, this means that this will be under condition that cola is not an inferior good. But because of the fact that now you're pushing the indifference curve to the bottom, this means that cola is now in inferior good because you're consuming less of it when there's an increase in your budget. And so that's how the indifference curve would be able to maximize your total utility of 2 goods, which is by having which is to combine your indifference curve and your budget line together, and then you calculate the point in which it's at the equilibrium. So these 2 curves combine together, and then you see where the point is, calculate the amount available. That will be the maximum possible combination. That's the maximum possible combination of two goods that one person can consume, and then maintaining their total utility. All right, and then substitution effect. It basically means the way that a change in price of a good affects relative prices, which is, as you can see here, this would be your substitution effect, which is from A to C. You see that before this, now let's say that the prices of, let's say the price of apples have, the price of apples have basically increased, and when the price of apples increase, you see that the bottles of cola remains the same, but then the maximum unit of apples I can purchase has now decreased from BL0 to BL1. And when it reduces from BL0 to BL1, the curve has now become something like this. And then you could take the curve and then go back to the original point. You have to make it tangent with the indifference curve. And when you make it tangent with the indifference curve, you realize that instead of point A, it's now point C. This means that assuming that you have more income, and then we are on the same indifference curve. This is when we have the same total utility, and then we have more income to be able to reach IC2. Then you can see that the amount of bottles of cola that you can purchase is now actually more because of the fact that the prices of apples have increased. Okay, this will be a substitution effect, which is the way that a change in price of a good affects relative prices. That is when you we are assuming that now the total utility that you want to be the same. The total utility that you want to be the same, just that there's a change in prices, so we move the budget line to be able to be tangent with our original indifference curve to see how much has changed when it comes to the quantity of apples that we can buy, assuming that we want it to be the same total utility. All right, this will be a substitution effect. And then for income effect, it reflects the way that a change in price of a good affects purchasing power, which is from B to C. If it's from B to C instead of from A to C will be a substitution effect, assuming that you want total utility. Now, if you move from, because of the fact that the prices have increased, so now instead of at point A, we are now at point B. But let's say your income increases to BL star, which is this one, then the amount of goods that you can afford with your purchasing power would now become C instead of B. For B, you'll purchase lesser bottles of cola and apples, but at C, you purchase more of both. All right, so that's how it works. And then if you look at the right side, this one is when apples are inferior good. So when apples are an inferior good, we can see that for substitution effect, this will be from A to C. Okay, you'll buy less apples if you want your total utility to be the same. And then for B to C would be your income effect. Okay, so you can see that in order to do so, you will have your IC curve to be positioned upwards. So when it's positioned upwards, you'll see that C would be lesser than B in total. All right, and then the quantity of apples you purchase will be lesser. And then from A to C, this is when if you want total utility to be the same, then you would purchase with the fact that now the prices of apples have increased. But then let's say you have an increase in budget, and then you want to match the same IC2 curve as before, the amount of apples and cola that you can purchase. Now you can see that because of the fact that apples are inferior goods, this means that when there's an increase in income, you buy less of apples and more of cola. All right, so that's how it works for both indifference curve and also the budget line. All right, so this is the end of the entire chapter. Actually, I summarized it down to only these two parts, which is your utility and your indifference curves and budget lines. And I hope you guys will be able to understand my explanation of marginal utility and consumer choice. If you have any questions, do comment down below. And then I'm going to work on the next chapter of the A2 economics syllabus. Stay tuned for that. And till then, this is qiphyedu.